Darkness. Not the kind that comes when you close your eyes. Not the kind that settles over your bedroom at night with streetlights bleeding through the curtains. No, this was different. This was an absolute void. A suffocating nothingness that pressed in from every direction. Ethan Graves woke up gasping, his breath clawing its way through his throat like it was trying to escape first. He couldn't see. He couldn't move. His hands brushed against something just inches from his face. A smooth wooden surface. His legs were pinned in place. His chest barely had room to rise and fall. The air was thick, stale, laced with the scent of earth and decay. His mind caught up a second later. Oh God, no, no, no. The panic hit like a hammer to the ribs. Ethan thrashed, slamming his elbows against the walls of his prison, his knees jerking uselessly. He was trapped. The walls were too close. There was no space to turn, no space to sit up. And the worst part? The more he moved, the faster the oxygen drained from his shallow tomb. He was in a coffin, buried, but he wasn't dead. A scream ripped from his throat, raw and desperate, but it barely made a sound. The earth above him swallowed it whole. No, 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 no. He slammed his fists against the lid. Somebody, help me. Silence. Panic coiled around his spine like a snake. He tried again, this time clawing at the wood, scraping at the edges with his fingernails until he felt splinters dig into his skin. His breathing quickened, his heartbeat hammering against his ribs like it was trying to break out before he did. This had to be a mistake, a nightmare, maybe some horrific prank. His mind was scrambling for answers, trying to make sense of it, because there was no way he had been buried alive. People didn't just wake up underground, unless a cold, horrible thought slithered into his brain. Was I murdered? Did someone do this to me? And if so, why? His breaths came too fast, too shallow. He squeezed his eyes shut, forcing himself to focus. Think, Ethan, think. He tried to reach for his last memory, but all he got was a hazy blur. He remembered leaving work late, stepping into the cold night. The parking lot mostly empty. His keys had been in his hand. He had been walking toward his car, and nothing. Just a blank void. His fingers brushed against his pants pocket, and that's when he felt it. Something small, metallic. He dug into the fabric and pulled it out with shaking hands. His heart nearly exploded with relief when he realized what it was. A lighter. He flicked it on. A tiny orange flame bloomed, casting a dim glow inside the coffin. It was just enough to see the wooden planks surrounding him. And something else. His stomach lurched. The walls of the coffin were covered in scratches. Words, dozens of carved messages, overlapping each other, gouged deep into the wood like they had been made in a frenzy. Ethan's breath hitched as he scanned the chaotic writing. Don't listen to them. It's not just dirt above you. Stay awake. His grip tightened around the lighter. What the hell? His voice came out hoarse, barely a whisper. The wood was old. Some of the words had faded, like they had been scratched there years ago. But the terrifying thing? Some looked fresh, as if someone had been here before him, as if someone had tried to warn him. A sudden, soft noise made his stomach drop. A whisper. Ethan froze, his ears strained in the suffocating silence. It had been faint, so faint he almost convinced himself he had imagined it. But then, you're not alone down here. The voice came from inside the coffin. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His fingers spasmed around the lighter, the tiny flame flickering wildly. No, that was impossible. He was alone. He had to be alone. His entire body went rigid. And then, tap. A sound. Tap. Tap. Something was knocking from inside the coffin. The air turned to ice. A slow, paralyzing terror crawled through Ethan's veins. His breath came out in short, trembling gasps. He wanted to scream, to break out of this hellhole, but his voice wouldn't work. Talk, talk, talk. This time, it was right next to his ear. And then the whisper came again, closer now. You shouldn't have woken up. Ethan lost it. He screamed, kicking against the coffin walls, thrashing with everything he had. The lighter slipped from his fingers, plunging him back into darkness. No! No! Let me out! Let me out! He kept banging, kept fighting, but the wood wouldn't budge. His lungs burned. The air was disappearing. He had to get out. He had to... A hand touched his wrist. A cold, skeletal hand. Ethan's breath hitched. His entire body seized up. Then the fingers tightened. The whisper came again. But this time, it wasn't just one voice. It was many. Go back to sleep, Ethan. The grip tightened more, and then the coffin started shaking. Ethan gasped, his lungs convulsing as he struggled for air that wasn't there. His arms flailed against the coffin's wooden walls, his body bucking in the tight space. But the worst part wasn't the crushing darkness, or even the suffocating knowledge that he was buried alive. The worst part was the hand, the ice-cold fingers wrapped around his wrist, thin and rigid like brittle twigs. They held firm, squeezing just enough for him to feel the knuckles grinding against his skin. He tried to jerk away, but the grip only tightened. Then came the whisper. "Go back to sleep, Ethan." Not just one voice this time. Many, a chorus of rasping murmurs, slithering over each other in a sickening harmony. Some were soft, others jagged, as if the throats that spoke had long since rotted away. He screamed, a raw, throat-shredding wail that should have echoed, should have gone somewhere. But it didn't. The coffin walls ate the sound, swallowed it whole like it had been waiting for this moment. Then the coffin started shaking. Not a little, violently. The entire box lurched, rocking side to side, as if something massive was shifting in the dirt above him. A terrible weight pressed down against the lid, and for one stomach-dropping moment, Ethan swore he felt breath from the other side. Hot, wet, decayed. The whispers turned to laughter. Low, hollow, and then all at once silence. The hand was gone. The weight above him vanished. Ethan was left panting in the dark, his chest rising and falling in short, desperate bursts. His skin was slick with sweat, his body trembling so hard he could hear the wood creak beneath him. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to force himself into a memory. Any memory, anything that made sense, but all he got was a headache. No, that wasn't true. He remembered something. Leaving work. His shift had gone late, and he'd been one of the last to leave. The parking lot had been almost empty. His car had been parked under a flickering streetlight. Then, pain. Something hard smashing into the back of his skull. His stomach twisted. Had someone attacked him? Knocked him out and buried him alive? No, that didn't make sense. If someone had gone through the trouble of burying him, they would have made sure he was dead first. So why was he still alive? And why the hell had there been a hand inside the coffin with him? He sucked in a slow breath, willing his nerves to settle. The panic wasn't helping him. If he had any chance of getting out of here, he needed to think. His lighter. He fumbled around the cramped space, his fingers brushing against his pockets until, yes, he found the cold metal shape of the lighter and flicked it open. A small flame sputtered to life, casting just enough glow to illuminate the coffin's interior. His stomach dropped. The carvings in the wood, the words scratched into the coffin's walls. They were different now. Before, they had been chaotic, overlapping warnings. Now, there was only one sentence, carved deep, fresh enough that splinters still curled from the letters. You were supposed to be dead. The breath fled from Ethan's lungs. His fingers tightened around the lighter, as if it could somehow protect him. The scratches hadn't been there before. He was sure of it, so that meant something had been in here with him, and it had written this message. His pulse pounded in his ears, a relentless drumbeat of get out, get out, get out. He had to move. His hands darted around the coffin, feeling for anything that could help him break free. His fingers brushed something hard, embedded in the wood, a rusty nail. He worked it loose, wincing as it scraped against his skin, but he didn't care. He needed something, anything to fight with. And then, just as he positioned himself to start prying at the coffin lid tap, a single deliberate knock. Right above his head, Ethan went still. The lighter flame flickered. His breath caught in his throat. Tap, tap, more knocks. Slow, rhythmic, waiting. His fingers clenched around the nail, his heart slamming against his ribs. And then, ever so slowly, the knocking turned into scratching. A long, dragging scrape, running from one end of the coffin to the other. The wood creaked under the weight of something moving above him. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think, could only stare at the flickering flame, his brain screaming at him to move, to fight, to do something before it was too late. The scratching stopped. Silence, and then a single breath exhaled just above the coffin lid. Something was waiting for him to open it. A deep, primal terror gripped Ethan's chest. He could feel his own heartbeat in his throat, feel the sweat sliding down the side of his face. No, he couldn't just wait here. He had to dig his way out. He raised the nail, positioning it at the coffin's wooden edge, and wham. Something slammed against the lid, shaking the entire coffin. The flame of the lighter snapped out, plunging him back into total darkness. His breath hitched. Then, the coffin lid began to splinter. Ethan screamed. He stabbed the nail upward, gouging at the wood, at whatever was pressing down on him. He thrashed, kicking, fighting, his mind spiraling into raw survival mode. The lid buckled, and then silence. He was panting, his body shaking, waiting for whatever nightmare was above him to finish the job. But nothing happened. Seconds crawled by, then minutes. He waited, heart hammering. Nothing. Had it gone? Ethan hesitated, then pressed his hands against the lid. He pushed gently, just enough to test it. It moved. His breath hitched. The weight above him was gone. Adrenaline kicked in. He pushed harder, ignoring the splinters digging into his palms. The wood cracked, dirt pouring in through the broken seams, but he didn't care. He kicked against the lower half, forcing more of the coffin open, letting cold air rush in. He was getting out. He was going to live. He forced his way up through the dirt, clawing, dragging himself toward the surface. And then his fingers hit something solid. Not just dirt. Something else was buried above him. And then it moved. Ethan's scream was lost in the soil. And from above, muffled but unmistakable, came a single, terrible whisper. It should have been you. The soil pressed against Ethan's face, filling his nostrils, his mouth, clinging to his tongue with the taste of rot. He thrashed, his fingers scraping against something cold and solid. Flesh. And then the thing above him moved. A muffled voice, barely more than a whisper, slithered through the dirt. It should have been you. Ethan's body seized with raw, animal panic. He kicked, shoved, clawed, trying to push whatever was above him away. But it didn't budge. It pressed back. No, 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 no. His lungs screamed for air. His heartbeat a thunderous drumbeat in his ears. He had to move, had to get out. The walls of the coffin had been tight, suffocating. But this was worse. The weight of the dirt, the thing above him. It was like the grave itself was swallowing him. He pressed both hands against the body and shoved as hard as he could. The thing's limbs shifted in the soil, its fingers brushing against his arms, its head lolling to the side, knocking against his own. The jaw unhinged, the sound of old cartilage snapping, and Ethan felt something soft and wet smear across his cheek. A mouth dragging open against his face. He screamed. He didn't care that the soil swallowed the sound. He thrashed, digging his elbows into the dirt, twisting, shoving himself sideways, anything to escape. The body lurched, its fingers spasming, and for one soul-crushing second, Ethan swore he felt it trying to grab him. Then it stopped. Ethan went still, his breath coming in short, frantic gasps. His face was still pressed into the dirt, his entire body trembling as he listened, waiting. Nothing. The body wasn't moving anymore. For a long, awful moment, he didn't move either. His chest burned. His fingers ached from digging. He tried to breathe as little as possible, afraid that at any second, the thing above him would twitch, sit up, speak. But it didn't. It was just a corpse. The relief was so overwhelming, he almost cried. Ethan pulled his arms beneath him and pushed upward, shifting sideways to slide past the body. His fingers finally broke into looser dirt, not packed, not suffocating, and suddenly air. He clawed upward, dragging himself through the last layers of soil. His head burst through the surface, and he gasped so hard his chest spasmed. Cool air rushed into his lungs, thick with the scent of damp earth. He coughed, spitting dirt from his mouth, his entire body shaking. His arms trembled as he dragged himself fully out of the grave, rolling onto his back. For a long time, he just lay there staring up at the sky. Except there was no sky. Above him stretched an endless black void, like the night had swallowed the world. No stars, no clouds, just nothing. His breath hitched. Ethan pushed himself up, arms weak, knees barely holding. He was in a graveyard. Rows of headstones stretched out in every direction, vanishing into the darkness. The ground was uneven, littered with fresh graves, some covered, others left open, yawning pits of soil and splintered wood. Some of the graves weren't empty. Shapes shifted in the holes. Bodies, they were moving. Ethan's stomach clenched. He stumbled back, his breath ragged. No, this wasn't possible. This wasn't. Something grabbed his ankle. He yelped, kicking wildly. A hand burst from the dirt beside him, skeletal fingers grasping his pant leg. The arm was thin, sickly, its skin stretched too tight over its bones. Ethan ripped free and staggered backward. The thing crawled out of the grave. Its body pulled itself free, long limbs unfolding in unnatural angles. Its jaw was too wide, its eyes sunk in pits of black. When it opened its mouth, It groaned, a hollow, rasping sound that made Ethan's bones feel like ice. Then it spoke. "You left me." Ethan's stomach twisted. The thing lurched forward, its fingers grasping at him. More shapes began pulling themselves from the graves, their bodies shifting in the darkness, whispering. Ethan ran. He didn't think. He didn't breathe. He just ran. His feet slammed against the dirt, his body moving on pure survival. He sprinted past headstones, past open graves, past things that twisted in the dark. A voice followed him, whispering, "Ethan." His lungs burned. His legs screamed, but he didn't stop. A figure loomed ahead, a man standing between two graves. Ethan skidded to a stop. The man was tall, thin, his skin sallow and stretched. His eyes were hollow, deep shadows sinking into his skull. His mouth curled into something that almost looked like a smile. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. He knew this man, Daniel Holt. Daniel's head tilted. His voice was soft, knowing. "Why did you leave me, Ethan?" Ethan's stomach dropped. His throat closed. "No." Daniel took a step forward. "I remember. Do you?" Ethan stumbled back, his legs nearly giving out. His mind screamed at him to run, to keep going, but his body wouldn't move. Because he did remember. The parking lot, the argument, the shovel, the dirt, burying him. Daniel shouldn't be here. Daniel was supposed to be dead. But as Ethan looked at the thing in front of him, the thing wearing Daniel's face, he realized he was never dead to begin with. Ethan had buried him alive, and now it was his turn. Daniel's smile widened. His head tilted again, almost playfully, and then, softly, he whispered, "Your grave is still open." Ethan's breath hitched, and then the ground beneath him collapsed. He fell back into the dirt, back into the grave, and as the soil rushed in around him, Daniel's voice echoed in the dark. "Breathe deep, Ethan." And then the grave swallowed him whole. The weight of the dirt crushed against Ethan's chest, forcing the air from his lungs in sharp, panicked bursts. His body twisted, hands clawing desperately at the soil as it filled the space around him, pressing into his mouth, his eyes, his ears. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His mind was a screaming blur of terror and suffocation. He had to get out. He had to. The dirt stopped. For a moment, everything went still. He wasn't sinking anymore. The soil wasn't tightening around his ribs. His lungs still burned, still fought for air, but there was space now, just enough to move. Just enough to realize that he wasn't alone. Something shifted beside him. Not above him, not below. Right next to him, a presence, a body. Ethan tried to turn, but the space was too tight. His shoulders scraped against rough wood, the broken remains of a coffin. His breath came in quick, shallow gasps as he tried to twist, to see. Then, a breath, hot and wet against his ear. His stomach clenched, his body went rigid. And then the whisper came, "You buried me, Ethan." His breath caught in his throat. His fingers spasmed in the dirt. He knew that voice. He'd heard it before, had heard it just moments ago, standing in the graveyard. Daniel Holt. Ethan's entire body seized with a panic so raw it nearly made him choke. He kicked wildly, shoving himself backward, but there was nowhere to go. The earth surrounded him on all sides. He could feel the weight of the grave pressing in, feel the broken coffin against his legs, his arms, his ribs. But Daniel shouldn't be here. He was dead. He had been dead for years. Another breath, this time closer. The heat of it sent a violent shudder down Ethan's spine. "Do you remember?" Ethan squeezed his eyes shut, willing the voice away, willing the entire nightmare away, but it didn't work. The memories were there now, clawing their way to the surface, just like he had clawed his way out of the grave. It had been 3 years ago, a drunken argument behind a bar. Fists had flown, harsh words, accusations. "You ruined my life, Ethan. You took everything from me." And Ethan had laughed because Daniel had been nothing, a washed-up loser who had gambled away his future, a friend that Ethan had outgrown. Just like a snake shedding its dead skin. Then the shovel had been in his hands, and he had swung. One hit, then another, and another, until Daniel stopped moving. Ethan had stood there, panting, his breath fogging in the cold night air. He had looked down at his friend, his best friend, and realized that he had gone too far. But there had been no one around, no witnesses, just an open construction site, piles of loose dirt, and a deep, unfinished pit that no one would bother looking in. So he had dragged Daniel's body to the edge, shoved him in, and buried him under 3 feet of dirt. He had stood over the fresh grave for a long time after that, waiting, expecting Daniel to sit up, to claw his way out. But he hadn't. Ethan had told himself that he was already dead, that he had been dead the moment the shovel hit his skull. He had told himself that for 3 years. Now, lying in the darkness, trapped beneath the same dirt, he knew the truth. Daniel had been alive when he buried him. And now, Daniel was here, a slow, crawling pressure wrapped around Ethan's wrist. Fingers, cold, bony fingers. Ethan thrashed. No, the grip tightened. You never even checked, Daniel whispered, his voice a cold, empty thing. You didn't even look. Ethan shook his head, his throat tight, his breath coming in quick, panicked gasps. I thought you were dead. A pause, and then a low, hollow laugh. The fingers tightened more, digging into his flesh, pulling. Ethan screamed. He twisted violently, trying to rip himself free, but the grip was impossibly strong. The dirt shifted around him, pressing into his skin, filling the space, crushing against his ribs. And then Daniel moved. Ethan could feel it, the slow, deliberate shift of bones and rotted flesh, the press of something thin and skeletal against his leg. Daniel was crawling closer. The weight of the grave closed in around Ethan, the walls tightening, the coffin splintering. The pressure in his chest grew unbearable. He could hear the soil shifting, the faint groan of wood as something pressed against it. Daniel was above him now. Ethan gasped, his throat raw and burning. His hands scrabbled uselessly at the dirt, trying to push himself free, but it was too late. He could feel Daniel's breath against his cheek, smell the sickly rot of old earth, and something deeper, something wrong. Then, fingers wrapped around his throat. Ethan choked. His hands flew up, grabbing at the cold, clammy wrists, trying to pry them away. But there was no strength left in him. His lungs screamed, his vision blurred, and then Daniel spoke. His voice was a whisper, soft and distant, as if drifting from some faraway place. Breathe deep, Ethan. Darkness closed in. Ethan's body spasmed once, twice, and then everything went still. Nothing. No breath. No heartbeat. No sound. Just silence. And then a sharp gasp. Air flooded his lungs. Ethan's eyes snapped open. He was standing. His body lurched forward, and for a moment his mind couldn't catch up. His last memory was the grave, the dirt, Daniel's hands around his throat. But now he was standing in a graveyard. The same graveyard as before. The endless rows of headstones, the open graves, the sky a perfect, empty black. But something was different now. The air was heavier, the silence deeper. And when he looked down at his hands, they weren't his. His skin was pale grayish, his fingers thin, stretched, his nails blackened. No. Ethan's stomach twisted, his breath hitched in his throat. And then behind him, a voice. Familiar. His voice. Ethan turned and saw himself, standing just a few feet away. His own body, his own face, alive, breathing, looking at him with wide, terrified eyes. The other Ethan, the real Ethan, staggered backward. His breath came fast, panicked. His hands clutched at his chest, feeling his own heartbeat, his own skin. And then, slowly, he looked up. Their eyes met. The horror in the real Ethan's face was absolute. And in that moment, Ethan, the thing that had woken up in this graveyard, the thing wearing the wrong body, understood. It wasn't Ethan anymore. Ethan was still alive. And he was something else now. Something dead. Something buried. But not gone. Not yet. Darkness pulsed inside him. It wasn't like before. The suffocating blackness of the coffin. The weight of the grave pressing down on his ribs. This was something else. Something deeper. Ethan, or whatever he was now, stared at himself. The real Ethan. The man standing just a few feet away, alive, breathing, his chest rising and falling in panicked bursts. His eyes were wide, wild with confusion, his hands trembling at his sides. The way he was looking at him, like he had seen something impossible, something wrong, sent a slow, curling sickness through Ethan's stomach. Because he understood now. He wasn't Ethan anymore. He wasn't in his own body. The realization spread through him like a slow infection. He didn't need to look down and know that the hands weren't his. The skin, pale, stretched too tight over sharp bones, wasn't his. The way his joints felt too loose, like his body didn't fit together properly, like he was being held up by something other than muscle and bone. This wasn't him. It was Daniel. He was in Daniel's body. A thick, suffocating silence stretched between them. The real Ethan took another step back, his breath coming fast, shallow. He was shaking his head over and over, like he was trying to force himself to wake up from a nightmare. Well, what the fuck is this? His voice came out strangled, barely more than a whisper. Ethan tried to respond, but the voice that left his lips wasn't his own. It was lower, wrong, rough like dry leaves scraping against wood. I don't know. The real Ethan flinched, his hands clenched in a fist at his sides, his knuckles white. No, this isn't happening. This is a dream. It has to be. Ethan swallowed hard, but he could feel it, the weight of this body, the way his limbs moved. Not quite right, too slow, like something pulling the strings from inside. This wasn't a dream. The real Ethan's breathing hitched. He looked around wildly, like he was expecting the world to snap back to normal at any second. But the graveyard was still there, stretching out into the endless black void. The headstones, the open graves, and then a sound, a low, wet shuffle in the dirt. Ethan's stomach twisted. They weren't alone. Shapes were moving in the graves. He could hear them, bodies shifting, bones creaking. The slow, dragging scrape of fingers clawing at the dirt. And then the whispering began. Soft, faint. A dozen voices, layered over each other, seeping from the graves like mist. Ethan stiffened. His skin crawled. He turned his head slowly, afraid of what he would see. Figures were pulling themselves from the earth. They weren't fast. They weren't sudden. They unfolded like old marionettes that had been left in the dirt for far too long. Limbs cracked, heads lolled, hands twitched against the ground. The whispering grew louder. Ethan felt something cold slither down his spine. They were talking to him, not the real Ethan, because he wasn't one of the living anymore. The real Ethan staggered back. His breathing was shaking now, his face twisted in something between horror and denial. And then a voice, not from the graves, not from the whispering dead, from behind them. You should run now. Both Ethans froze. The voice was low, smooth, and painfully familiar. Ethan turned first. His body felt wrong, stiff, like his muscles weren't used to moving this way. And then he saw him. Daniel, the real Daniel. Not a corpse, not rotting, not broken. He stood just outside the rows of graves, watching. His body was whole, his skin smooth, his eyes dark, sunken but bright with something cold. He looked alive, but he wasn't. Ethan could feel it. The real Ethan staggered backward, shaking his head. No, this isn't possible. Daniel's mouth curved into something that almost looked like a smile. And yet, here we are. His voice was calm, steady, like he had been waiting for this. Ethan felt sick, because Daniel should be dead. And yet, he was here, alive, whole, watching them like a man watching an insect struggle in a web. The whispering grew louder. The things crawling from the graves were getting closer. And Daniel, the real Daniel, he just stood there. Ethan's breath came in short, shallow bursts. His mind was screaming, racing, trying to piece together something impossible. And then Daniel said softly, "You should run now." This time Ethan listened. He turned and ran. So did the real Ethan, side by side, one alive, one dead. And behind them, the whispering grew into screams. Ethan ran. His legs burned. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, but he didn't stop. The real Ethan was beside him, sprinting over the uneven graveyard terrain, his movements frantic and desperate. Their footfalls pounded against the loose soil, kicking up dust and decay. But behind them, the dead were faster. The whispering had turned to shrieks, a chorus of broken voices crying out in anger, in hunger, in recognition. They knew him. Ethan could feel it, the way their presence pulled at him, like invisible hands grasping at the edges of something he didn't fully understand. They weren't chasing the real Ethan. They were chasing him, the dead one. His body was wrong. Too light, too cold. His joints didn't bend the way they should. He felt like a puppet strung together with frayed rope, his limbs moving in sharp, jerking motions as he ran. Every step was unsteady, like his body had forgotten what it was supposed to do. The real Ethan stumbled beside him, nearly tripping over a fallen headstone. His face was twisted in pure panic, his breath wheezing as he gasped. What the fuck is happening? Ethan didn't have an answer. He couldn't even think. The only thing that mattered was running. Ahead of them, the graveyard stretched endlessly into the black void. There was no exit, no road, no sign of the world they had known before. Just tombstones and dirt, and the open graves they had crawled from. And behind them, the shrieking mass of the dead. Ethan could hear them, feel them, the way their presence dug into his skin like hooks. They weren't normal. They weren't just bodies. They were wrong. their limbs too long, their faces twisted into expressions of endless suffering. Some of them crawled, others ran. Their fingers were too sharp, their eyes too black, too empty. The graveyard tilted beneath them. The ground seemed to pulse, shifting like something alive, something breathing. Ethan's foot hit an uneven patch, and his leg buckled beneath him. He went down hard, dirt scraping against his palms. The real Ethan didn't stop running. For one terrible moment, their eyes met. Ethan saw it there, the hesitation, the fear, but then the real Ethan turned away. He kept running. Ethan's chest seized. Wait. His voice was wrong, rough and jagged like something rotting. But the real Ethan was already disappearing into the darkness. And the dead were here. A hand clamped around his ankle. Cold, brittle, the fingers dug into his flesh, pulling. Ethan screamed. He kicked, thrashed, trying to break free, but more hands burst from the ground, skeletal fingers wrapping around his arms, his legs, his throat. The dead crawled over him. They knew him. They were claiming him. Ethan's vision blurred. The world spun, his limbs locking, his breath choking out of his lungs. The whispering was everywhere, 1,000 broken voices crying out at once. You don't belong here. You stole this. You took what wasn't yours. The hands dragged him downward. The soil split open beneath him, a yawning pit of blackness, and he felt himself falling. The last thing he saw was the real Ethan, still running, still alive. Then the earth swallowed him whole. Darkness. Ethan woke somewhere else. He was lying on something cold and hard. The scent of dust and mildew filled his nose. The air was heavy, thick with something ancient, stagnant. Slowly, he sat up. His limbs ached. His head pounded. But he was still here, still in this body. Daniel's body. His stomach twisted. He had fallen. The dead had been pulling him down, dragging him back into the earth. But now he was somewhere new. The room around him was massive, lined with towering stone walls covered in deep, unfamiliar carvings. The symbols twisted and curled, moving in ways that made his head ache when he tried to focus on them. The ceiling stretched impossibly high, disappearing into darkness. Rows of wooden coffins filled the space, some stacked, some lined against the walls. The smell of dirt, rot, and something older clung to the air. A mausoleum? No, a catacomb. Ethan swallowed hard, his throat dry and tight. His heartbeat pounded in his ears, but he forced himself to his feet. The stone beneath him was ice cold, his bare feet stinging with the chill. He took a slow, shaky breath. Then he heard it, a voice, a slow, dragging whisper from somewhere in the dark. You should have stayed buried. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His fingers clenched. His skin crawled, because he knew that voice. Daniel, the real Daniel. Not the body Ethan had stolen. Not the corpse Ethan had left behind. The real one. He wasn't done yet, and Ethan was trapped with him. Ethan didn't move. The whisper hung in the air, curling around him like a slow-moving fog, seeping into his skin. His breath was shallow, barely there. He strained his ears, listening past the pounding in his skull, past the tightness in his stolen body's chest. He wasn't alone in the catacombs. Daniel was here, somewhere in the darkness. Ethan turned in slow, careful steps, his bare feet scraping against the cold stone floor. The towering walls loomed above him, covered in carvings that shifted when he looked too closely, twisting symbols that seemed to breathe, to blink. Wooden coffins lined the walls, stacked haphazardly, some of them half open, others splintered apart. The air was thick with the scent of dust and rot, like something had been sealed down here for a long, long time. Another whisper, closer now. You don't belong here. The voice didn't echo. It was right next to him. Ethan's body tensed. He clenched his fists, his fingers tightening against the unnatural cold of Daniel's stolen skin. Where are you? His voice was wrong, rough and dry, like dead leaves crushed underfoot. It wasn't his voice. It would never be his voice again. The darkness moved. A shape pulled itself free from the shadows ahead of him, slow and deliberate, unfolding with an almost unnatural grace. Daniel, not his body, not the rotting corpse Ethan had woken up inside. The real Daniel, the one that had been buried, the one that shouldn't be here. Ethan felt his stomach lurch. Daniel looked whole, alive, not decayed, not broken. His skin was smooth, almost too smooth. His face caught somewhere between life and death, frozen in an expression that didn't quite belong to him. His clothes were still torn, still streaked with dried earth. But his eyes were wrong. Dark pits, too deep, too hollow. They swallowed the dim light from the catacombs, absorbing it. Ethan felt himself sinking into them. "You took it," Daniel whispered. "You stole it." Ethan took a step back. His breath came faster now, shallow and sharp. I don't know what happened. I woke up and I was just in my body. The air grew heavier. Ethan could feel something pressing against his skin, inside his skin, like a presence crawling beneath it. His pulse throbbed. His vision blurred for a moment. The world twisting around him. The walls of the catacombs seeming to close in. Daniel stepped forward. His bare feet made no sound. "I felt it, he said. His voice was flat, empty of emotion. The dirt, the weight of it, the air disappearing. My lungs... He let out a hollow laugh. My lungs wouldn't stop screaming. Ethan's stomach turned. Daniel stopped just a few feet away, his head tilting slightly, too slow, too unnatural. "You buried me, Ethan. You didn't even check. You didn't even..." His face changed. A flicker of something wrong. His skin sagged just for a moment. His jaw cracked. The bones of his cheeks shifted, as if something was underneath, trying to push its way out. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Daniel blinked, and his face was normal again. Or as normal as it could be. "But that's not the worst part," he said, almost conversationally. "The worst part is that I woke up down here in the dark alone." His voice turned softer. "I waited for you." Ethan's chest tightened. His legs felt frozen, but every instinct was screaming at him to run. Daniel smiled, and then he lunged. Ethan barely had time to react. Daniel's hands clamped around his throat, fingers digging into his skin with a strength that wasn't human. Ethan gasped, tried to tear himself free, but Daniel's grip was iron. "You don't get to have my body," Daniel hissed. His face was inches away now, his breath cold as the grave. "You don't get to take from me again." Ethan thrashed. His hands clawed at Daniel's wrists, but he was too strong. The pressure in his skull built, his vision darkening at the edges. The carvings on the walls shifted, twisting, moving, watching. The coffins rattled. The whispering began again, not from Daniel, but from the walls, from the air, from the stone itself. A deep groan filled the catacombs, and then the floor collapsed beneath them. Ethan felt himself falling, spinning into blackness, his stolen body twisting through the air. And then nothing. Ethan hit the ground hard. His stolen body crumpled against the cold, uneven earth, pain lancing up his spine. His vision blurred, his breath ragged as he forced himself onto his hands and knees. Dirt clung to his fingers, coarse and damp, the scent of rot thick in the air. The fall should have killed him, but of course it hadn't, because he was already dead. The realization churned in his gut as he pushed himself upright, his stolen limbs too light, too wrong. He still wasn't used to this body, the looseness of it, the unfamiliar weight. His skin felt stretched, his joints stiff, as if the thing inside him wasn't fully settled. The darkness around him shifted, stretching into something vast. A graveyard, not like the one before. This one was endless. Rows upon rows of headstones stretched into infinity, vanishing into the black horizon. The sky above was a yawning void. No stars, no moon, just emptiness. The air was heavy, thick with something unseen, pressing against him from all sides. Ethan's chest tightened. No, not his chest. Daniel's. He was still trapped in Daniel's body. He turned, his heartbeat, not really, thudding unevenly. His gaze darted across the graveyard, searching. Where was Daniel? The last thing he remembered was falling. The catacomb floor giving way. Daniel's hands locked around his throat. And then nothing. Now Daniel was gone. Ethan's stomach twisted. His fingers curled into fists. Was it over? Had he escaped? No, that would be too easy. A wind stirred, sweeping through the graves, carrying with it the faintest sound, a whisper. Ethan froze. It came again, soft, layered, 100 voices, overlapping, rising from the ground itself. He turned slowly, dread crawling up his spine. The graves were open. Not just one, not just a few. All of them. Every headstone stood over a yawning pit of darkness, the dirt disturbed, as if something had already climbed out. A cold weight settled in Ethan's stomach. The whispering grew louder. Shapes shifted in the distance. Figures stood among the graves, dozens of them, hundreds. Their outlines were faint, wavering in the dim, unnatural light, like shadows barely clinging to form. Ethan swallowed hard. Who are you? The whispering didn't stop. The figures didn't move. Then a step. One of the dead things moved forward, its shape flickering. Then another. Ethan's breath caught. He took a step back, his stolen heartbeat hammering against his ribs. The figures were coming toward him, slow at first, cautious, measured. Then, faster. The whispering turned to chattering, then moaning, then screaming. The figures charged. Ethan ran. He didn't think, didn't breathe. He just moved. His feet pounded against the uneven ground, his stolen lungs heaving for air he didn't need. The graves blurred past him, the endless headstones stretching out in all directions. There was nowhere to go. The graveyard didn't end. The figures were closing in. And then ahead of him, a door, tall, ancient, a massive iron gate, half buried in the ground, standing alone among the graves. It looked wrong, like it had been pulled from somewhere else, some other time, some other place. Ethan's breath hitched. He didn't question it. He ran for the door. The whispering rose to a scream. The figures were almost upon him, their movements jerking, unnatural, their mouths yawning open and silent. Endless cries. Ethan reached the gate. He grabbed the iron handle and pulled. The door swung open, and the world lurched. A force yanked him forward. Not physically, but something deeper, something inside. The whispering, the graveyard vanished, and Ethan was falling. Again, but this time, there was no ground waiting for him below. Just the endless, gaping void. Ethan fell, not like before. Not the sharp drop through broken stone and splintered wood. This was endless. The sensation of falling without air, without gravity, without direction. There was no up or down, no ceiling, no floor, just a yawning void swallowing him whole. His stomach lurched, twisting itself into knots that didn't belong to him. Daniel's stomach, Daniel's nerves, the body he had stolen clung to him, heavier than ever, stretching over his bones like a second skin that didn't quite fit. Then, the ground slammed into him. Hard. His body crumpled against something solid, knocking the breath from his lungs that weren't his. He groaned, rolling onto his side, pain shooting through his ribs. His vision blurred. The air was thick, humid, reeking of earth and something deeper, something rotting. Slowly, he pushed himself up and froze. He wasn't in the graveyard anymore. He was somewhere worse. It stretched endlessly, this place, this mass of bodies, this field of the dead. Not buried, not rotting in coffins. They were standing, hundreds of them. Thousands, a sea of silent, unmoving corpses, packed together so tightly that they looked like one massive, pulsing thing. Their skin wasn't right. Some gray, some blackened with decay, others dry and cracked like old paper. Some had no eyes, some had too many, and they were watching him. 1,000 lifeless stares locked onto him the moment he moved. Ethan's breath hitched. His body screamed at him to run. But there was nowhere to go. The bodies stretched forever, disappearing into the thick haze that clung to the horizon. The sky, if there was one, was a deep, suffocating red, churning like liquid. The silence was unbearable. Then, a voice. Not from them, not from the silent dead, from somewhere beneath them. Low, distant, a rumbling whisper that made Ethan's bones feel like ice. One of us. Ethan's body locked up. The whisper came again, rising from the ground, from the air, from the bodies themselves. One of us. Then the dead moved. Not all at once, not fast. One by one, they turned, their heads tilted, their mouths opened. Not in screams, not in words, just open, as if something else was speaking through them. The whisper came again. You do not belong. Ethan stumbled back. His heart slammed against his ribs. His breathing was too fast, too loud in the suffocating silence. He didn't belong, because he wasn't one of them. Not yet. The dead stepped forward. Ethan ran. His feet slammed against the cold, wet ground, slipping, sliding, but he didn't stop. The dead weren't fast, but they never stopped moving. An endless wave of bodies, stepping forward, shifting, closing in. The whispering grew louder. Behind him, above him, below him. You took what was not yours. Ethan's chest tightened. Daniel. This was because of Daniel. Because he had stolen his body. Because he had buried him alive. Because he had made him suffer. And now Ethan was next. His foot caught something, a hand, reaching from the ground. He crashed forward, hitting the dirt hard. His hand sank into something wet, pulpy flesh. The ground was made of bodies. He screamed. Something wrapped around his ankle. Cold fingers. Too many of them. He kicked, thrashed, but the hands wouldn't let go. The whisper was everywhere now. Give it back. Give it back. Give it back. The dead collapsed onto him, a wave of rot and bone, dragging him down, 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 and then a new voice. One he recognized. Ethan. The bodies froze. Ethan gasped, his entire body trembling. The hands still wrapped around his arms, his legs, his throat. But they weren't pulling anymore. He turned his head, vision swimming, and there he was. Daniel, standing at the edge of the endless dead, watching. Whole, smiling, waiting. He lifted a hand and motioned. Come home. The dead let go. And Ethan fell into darkness. Ethan plunged into darkness. The cold was instant, wrapping around him like a shroud, pulling him down, down into something deeper than earth, deeper than the grave, deeper than anything he had ever known. The whispering of the dead vanished, replaced by silence so complete it felt like a living thing pressing against his ears. And then a single breath, slow, measured, not his own. Ethan's body hit something solid. Not dirt, not stone, something smoother, older. It felt like wood. No. A splintering crack echoed through the void, and suddenly, Ethan wasn't falling anymore. He was lying down. His arms were tight at his sides. His chest barely had space to rise and fall. The air was thick, damp, familiar. The scent of wood and soil filled his lungs. His heart lurched. No, not again. The silence stretched, pressing against his skull like the weight of 1,000 unseen hands. He could feel the space around him, the walls, the lid just inches from his nose, the dirt above him, packed tight. A coffin. He was in a coffin, buried, but not dead. His breath hitched, panic clawing at his ribs. He slammed his fist against the wood, screaming, thrashing. Nothing moved. The weight of the grave held firm. He gasped, chest heaving, trying to think, trying to remember. The graveyard, the endless dead, the whispering voices. Daniel. His stomach twisted. He had seen him, standing there, whole, watching, smiling. And then, Daniel had called him home. Ethan's hands shook. He reached out, fingertips scraping against the coffin walls. And then he felt them. The scratches. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Warnings. The same ones he had seen when he first woke up, trapped beneath the earth. Don't listen to them. It's not just dirt above you. Stay awake. His pulse thundered in his ears. He squeezed his eyes shut. No, this wasn't happening. This wasn't real. He had already escaped. He had already dug himself free. But now he was here again. Why? A soft noise slithered through the silence. Ethan's body locked up. It was faint, barely there. A sound just above him. A whisper. You stole it. His stomach dropped. The whisper came again, closer this time. You took my body, Ethan. Daniel. The coffin shuddered. The dirt above him shifted, pressing tighter. Ethan gasped, his breath shaking. No, I didn't mean to. A sharp knock. Right above his head, his lungs locked up. Then, the whisper changed. It was inside the coffin with him now. You should have stayed buried. Ethan screamed. The coffin collapsed inward. Dirt rushed in, filling his mouth, his nose, his lungs. He kicked, thrashed, but the grave swallowed him whole. And then nothing. No air, no light, no escape. Only silence. And Ethan never woke up again.